not to kind of like use that to sort of like drift over to Magic the Gathering,
No,
which
no,
is
go ahead. Go ahead.
like I said, I've seen that just from the like I said from the more from like the distribution end. I'm kind of we deal a lot with like the retail businesses and stuff, so I'm not like necessarily in with the player base. But one thing I can tell you, just as a fan, as a hobbyist myself, that was another interesting thing. You mentioned maybe earlier that all these arenas have become political, and that was what was funny about Magic the Gathering. Is it's like I didn't remember there being anything political about it,
Right.
right? And I that's the thing that I think has also sort of changed, where it's like even your hobby, like you can't enjoy that hobby now with anybody who might have different values from you. You would think that like
But
being able to like, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
oh no, so what's frustrating about that is they're talking about inclusion, but they're
Hmm.
excluding diversity of thought, right?
Right, right, yeah.
Which
And
is the diversity that matters the most.
mhm.
I don't.
And I think a lot of the areas of common ground are areas where instead of talking about our differences, we could have this, say, unified hobby. And then as we're talking about the hobby, this thing that we can both agree that we like, right? It helps us to see each other as people, right? Not just points of view or opposing points of view, right? It's just like imagine you want to hang out with someone that happens to just share very different values from you, right? But maybe you play basketball every Saturday together,
Both love
and
Star
you get
Wars.
yeah, or you both love Star Wars, and
Yeah.
maybe hey, I see this guy Gary every year at the Star Wars convention, and it's like, and maybe you're like an atheist, and maybe Gary's a Mormon, and you think to yourself, when would this atheist and these Mormon ever have like this common ground to interact and to learn how to live together? It's like, oh, okay, well, they have this neutral activity like basketball or something, and they
Mm.
both love basketball, so they can get together, they can enjoy the sport of basketball, and they can find themselves loving their who they might consider to be
Stranger.
their
Yeah.
political enemy.
Yeah.
Yeah, but all of a sudden you're like, no, Gary's cool, and he plays a really mean forward, man, he's
Yeah.
good. It's like, and I think that's what it was like in Magic in the early days. Is it's like you it's like I played Magic cards with so many people that maybe I kind of actually even slightly disliked,
Oh yeah, like
right?
wrestlers, football players. You know, guys that used
Yeah.
would pick on you in the hall, but then,
Hmm.
out of sight from other people, they're like, "Hey, I heard you got a burn deck. Let's go."
And yeah, that's you nailed it right there. It's just like it gave a place for these people to interact that was like neutral ground. So then all of a sudden, when the neutral ground became politicized, right?
Mm.
That was the tragedy, right? It's just like it wouldn't have mattered what point of view they took. The fact that they were politicizing it in any sense, right? So it's like I don't mean to make it sound like um, I'm not for like any sort of representation, because I actually kind of like it, like
True.
to a certain degree, right? Where it's like and we're very fortunate being from Hawaii because we've already got to experience it. Like how great it is. Like how much do we all benefit from the fact that we've all shared food together,
Mm.
right? It's like I can't go back to living in a place that doesn't have like a Korean place to eat, a Filipino place to eat, a Chinese place to eat. Maybe I'll go get some Mexican food. It's just like and I felt like um that's one thing that is kind of a shame because I like I love say watching um something like The Simpsons,
Mm.
but I've also really benefited from all the wonderful animation that has come out of Japan, like
True.
Miyazaki, right? And that's the good sort of, right, inclusion that you want. It's like
So,
it's not it's not inclusion to the exclusion of something else like you mentioned before,
mm,
right? It's like it's just more. It's like more animation, more food, more comics,
in
right?
in a
Not like
in a
yeah.
sense, when they politicize these overarching, like, I want to say, umbrella platforms or interests,
Hmm.
they're getting rid of the melting pot.
Yeah, right, right. So it's like because that's the thing because um I always every time I see something that's being sort of like let's say altered for the
Mm,
sake of like having different ethnicities represented, for example, right? I think to myself, why not just make another story featuring those characters in something that's like genuine, right? Like you see this problem that they're encountering right now. I mean, not to use something that's like pretty recent, but the idea of taking a character called like Snow White,
true.
right, and deliberately, casting someone of like an olive or swarthy complexion,
Yeah.
right? And it's just like you could have had there's so many stories. It's like let's have her story too. Also, like we can have Snow White and we can have this. It's like there's so much room for more, right? That there's no need to have to include like change things and take away one story in order to present a different one, right?
Yeah.
And I think that was the kind of one of the lies that we were sort of being fed. And that's another thing, not to kind of bring back a little bit of comedy, but that kind of came out of a scarcity mentality. And I think the internet really kind of broke up that scarcity mentality when comedians were fighting for a limited amount of spots on late night television, in order to deliver their comedy so they could hopefully book a tour, something like that. There was this feeling of scarcity, but the internet completely shattered that. You realize that one comic getting an opportunity does not take away your opportunities to
Oh, true.
also play the same rooms, right? And I think that's the illusion that people still had in maybe say like movies or television and other sorts of areas of the culture where they felt as though there was this idea of scarcity that like not everyone could win. So rather than just bringing more people into the fold, that mentality of scarcity was held on to a little too tightly. So
So essentially, that people are treating things like a zero sum game, right?
yeah, oh yeah,
Yeah.
great terminology. I love that. Yeah, like a zero sum game. And then
Yeah.
that was the illusion shattering thing. And I have another comedian to thank for this. I think Joe Rogan.
Mm.
Um, he definitely shattered that illusion of scarcity because when you realize that like it was like because there was this period of time when like he was bringing his friends onto his podcast and all his friends started to branch out and have their own podcasts and have their own giant careers in their own sense, and then those comics were fostering the next generation of and then you're just like, oh, there's
Limit.
no limit to
Yeah.
it. Yeah, the only limitation is can this person perform, right? And I think that should be it too, right? With all these types of things, it's just like quality should be our measure, right? So,
Uh, from what you've said, it certainly looks like comedy is not in danger of any of these wild ideas, whatever the political
mhm.
extremes are talking about. So,
Yeah.
hopefully, this meritorious effort will translate into transforming the culture back or righting itself. They talk about the pendulum swinging back and forth and
Hmm.
pendulums all swinging this way, swing it back. But if you really pay attention, people are fighting for that pendulum to stay where it is. But
Hmm.
hopefully, all the creatives, everyone within these creative spaces, within these fandoms, will
Mhm.
find the voice and find the truth of, just existing, just living a fulfilling life. I don't know.
Yeah, it's kind of like to, wow, this okay, this might be a little bit of controversial, Chad. Like cut this if it doesn't work.
Okay.
But what I found is that um in the same way that sometimes when people formulate arguments, they'll um have like say a self-defeating statement, right?
Okay.
Like like one of my favorite self-defeating statements is someone who would try to claim that there is no absolute truth,
Oh,
right?
okay. Okay.
And then the reason why that's self-defeating is because you can simply say, well,
That's
is that
absolute.
true?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that an absolute truth, what you just said, that there are no absolute truths,
Mm.
right? And I was starting to kind of see this sort of like cannibalization, right? Like you would think in some sense that there would be like a unity on one side, right? Because there, but there's something about the nature of like canceling and um, identity politics and all these types of behaviors that it really does sort of like because they're so about division, right? You know, they're talking about inclusivity, but what are you doing when you're separating people into groups? You're really dividing,
Yeah.
right? And I mean, to use a biblical quote, a house divided cannot stand,
Mm.
right? So you started to kind of see that where it's like everybody was getting a little bit too into their niches. And I think I might have mentioned this to you in just a previous conversation we had, but you know, there was uh, a group of local comedians, and they call they were all women,
Mm.
right? And this was during like the big like diversity push, and then they got hit with an interesting challenge: is um, was their organization also meant for transgender women,
Mm.
right? Because that was the big thing. Transgender women are women. But I think what was really conflicting all of them in some sense was they when they really kind of thought about it, they're just like on a social level, they were able to recognize, you know, the transgender comic as a woman. They were happy to use her pronouns. They were happy to, you know, like I said, in all the social ways to recognize that person's stated identity,
So
right?
it's their virtuous and ethical moral centers that were saying, yes, I agree with that. But
Yeah.
when you conflate language like that,
Hmm.
eroding the difference, you're actually doing a disservice to both.
Right, because then they started really thinking like, huh, if someone who's a man can also be a woman, then what is a female comic? And like I
True.
said, and then you start to see this kind of erode, and then people realize it's like, oh, I don't want to make my identity as a woman my primary identity when doing comedy because I can see how that in some sense it doesn't have like objective meaning,
Mm.
right? To be a woman. There was no like hard ground for it anymore. And you started to see like a lot of not resentment develop, but it can be frustrating to think that like all these opportunities you thought you were providing to women, right? Now one of the primary beneficiaries of these female
Our
opportunities
biological man.
is is a biological man who had lived like
uh,
you know his
yeah.
basically his entire life with the benefits of being a man, and and whether people would were ready to admit it or not, it's just like the women felt like they had something taken away. It's like, dang, we're not even the top comic, right? In a world where we tried to make it exclusive for women. Now men have even broken into this space for us, right?
Mm.
And and then and so I feel like women had to bear a lot of the it was much tougher for them, honestly, than it was for me as a guy in the comedy world. Because and I think you also saw that in other areas. Like the most prominent one I think was in sports,
Oh yeah,
right?
that's still
It's
an issue.
yeah,
Naga,
so mhm.
it's a grappling agent or organization. They had
Mm,
to make adjustments to their policy because they were allowing trans women to do grappling, jujitsu, and stuff with women,
yeah.
and the women were not okay with it because they were frightened by some of the athletes. So now trans women have to compete with men.
Oh yeah, and but you see that it's just
Yeah.
like just putting it in one pool. And once again, it's just one thing I loved about comedy is that's what was so glorious about it. Is it truly was an environment where men and women did compete as equals. So that's also why people realized very quickly no need to make the distinction
True.
between men and women,
True.
right? It's just like we're all there's no male advantage to comedy, there's no female advantage to comedy. If you're funny, you're funny. And and I mean, heck, I've even seen people who have like speaking disorders. I've seen
Oh yeah.
people in wheelchairs. There's one of the best comics in Hawaii was a blind guy,
Mm.
right? So it's just like you really got to see it there, where it's just like there was no need to separate based on these like perceived differences, because in some sense that like it really was a neutral playing field for all involved.
It's like
So
chess.
yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
while I feel like the remnants of those entities still exist, I feel like the it now is more of just a brand, as opposed to being like a more of like you mentioned, like a political movement where it was felt like it was being politicized.
Mm.
And because there were times where articles were being published in the midweek paper, about these like overcoming, struggling women who are being like held down.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think very quickly they realize, like, oh, I'm actually getting more opportunities because I'm a woman.
Mm.
And uh so that, those all these kinds of false assumptions just kind of melted away. And believe me, I'm sure, like, I've heard stories from comics who had grown up at like a different era, maybe like in the 90s, or much earlier. And there was a little bit more of a boys club back then,
Oh
and
yeah.
that was also just kind of the way sort of things were. But what's funny is it's also self-selecting as well, because while there are more female comics than there have ever been, right?
Mm-hmm.
You still see that it's still a largely male dominated activity. And I
Well,
think that's just and it's, to me, I think that's evidence that things are healthy. Because the truth is, if you were to just survey every man and woman on the planet, I think that you would just find that that's the natural breakdown, is
true.
that in certain areas of life it's not going to split 50-50,
So
you know.
that's where the idea of equity, equality of outcome, is
Hmm.
so toxic because you're not going to get a even distribution in any given area based off
Right.
of gender,
Yeah.
sex, you know, ethnicity. All these things will
Right.
not break down to the or match the actual numbers in real life. So it's
Totally.
like
Yeah.
so there's two things. So one, they're using language to conflate stuff. So when you're saying stuff like same, the truth is we're not the same. We're similar.
Mm.
So when they
Hmm.
conflate women with trans women,
Hmm.
it's not true because they're similar, not the same, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Um, and I think what's funny is too, and this is just once again, I'm not saying this is true for all people, but one thing that I was very good friends with like actually kind of a notable like Hawaii comic,
Mm-hmm.
um and that was trans,
Mm-hmm.
and you know and she was excellent at comedy, you know. And but also what was funny is I think there was a certain trying or attempt to mainstream things that never even necessarily wanted to be mainstream, right? Like my impression that I was getting from certain you know like I said, from like a transgender comedian is like, yeah, they don't have any illusion that like, oh, next step, perform at an elementary school like Frank DeLima,
Right.
right? It's like, and I think that's fine. I think some people know that they're fringe, and it's okay that they're fringe. And we don't need to hunt people down because they're different and they're strange. But let's not take, in some sense, I don't want to remove that from certain people.
Mm.
Because like that is like, in some sense, not where they belong, but where they find their true expression, right? It's like trying to conform someone who's so different, right? Because that's the thing about like a transgender comic, it's not common,
But
right?
that's
So
the
let's not,
second thing I
yeah.
wanted to point out is they're trying to
Mm-hmm.
normalize the specific differences. So what's
Mm-hmm.
normal is that we're different, not the specific differences.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
Oh man,
Yeah.
that's so it right there. That you're right, but and I think that's exactly what I was getting to. It's like you rob those special people of their specialness by trying to pretend like it's not special.
Right. Right.
You know? So, yeah, yeah, very cool, man.